This is the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast, a podcast brought to you by two physical therapists devoted to helping physical therapists and other healthcare providers become better educators to patients, students, the community, and each other by interviewing prominent and passionate people within the realms of healthcare and education. The Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast is intended literally for educational and entertainment purposes only. No clinical decision-making should be based on only one source, and therefore this podcast should not be used as personal medical advice. While care has been taken to ensure accuracy, occasionally mistakes and factual errors can be present, as we are only human. This is our journey on the road to becoming better educators, so get ready with your pen and paper as class is about to begin.
Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast. I'm F. Scott Field, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Brandon Pone. Today's guest is Dr. Cheryl Keller Capone. She is a research associate in the Center for Comparative Genomics and Bioinformatics in the Department of Biochemistry and Molecular Biology at Penn State University. She got her PhD in biochemistry and molecular biology from Penn State University in 1999. Her graduate research focused on embryonic muscle differentiation in fruit flies, which earned her the Frederick J. Welder Outstanding Doctoral Dissertation Award. After completing her PhD, she transitioned to the field of neuroscience for a postdoc, also at Penn State, where her research focused on the molecular biology of GABA-A receptors in mice. After her postdoc, she did a brief stint in industry where she did technical work in the field of mitochondrial DNA forensics. Additionally, she has also worked as a freelance writer and editor, writing online educational materials and editing scientific textbooks, as she has taught several classes at Penn State. In 2009, she returned to Penn State, where she's currently working in the field of genomics as a research associate and project manager. She's involved in several projects with an overall research goal of understanding molecular mechanisms and gene regulation in mammals using blood cell development. Also in 2009, Cheryl suffered a series of running-related injuries that led to many years of chronic pain. As part of her physical rehabilitation, she developed a passion for movement and strength training, and later went on to earn a certificate as a personal trainer. She now trains clients on a part-time basis in her home gym. More recently, she also developed and taught a running workshop called Run Healthy, Run Strong for her local running community. Cheryl, thanks so much for joining us. We're so glad to have you on the show tonight.
Oh, thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, I think it's been really interesting to see you kind of make the rounds on a lot of the physical therapy podcasts, not being directly related to physical therapy, but your story really resonates true with a lot of us. So could you tell us a little bit about your area of expertise and what you've been up to?
Sure, yeah. So as you mentioned, I've been studying blood cell development at Penn State, and we use blood cell development as a model system to learn more about gene regulation, so how genes are turned on, how genes are turned off. And we try to do this in a normal system to learn about how the processes happen in normal cells, and so that when there's a disease state, then we can ask questions and learn more about those disease processes. So some blood disorders, which you may have heard of, would be like thalassemias, sickle cell, anemia. And so by learning about, the differences between what's happening in a normal system versus what's happening in a disease state, we can gain more information, and which can better lead to treatment of those diseases. And we use a genomics approach. And what I like to just give a quick analogy about genomics to kind of differentiate between genetics and genomics. And I think that I like to use analogy of a symphony when I talk about genomics and the difference between the two. And if you think about like a very large symphony with all different kinds of instruments, and they're all playing together, and there's a lot of harmony and it's all flowing. And then if there's something maybe going a little bit wrong, we can look at the symphony as a whole to try and identify the relationships between genes and how they're being turned on and turned off. So for example, if you're really at genetics, that's usually like a gene-centric approach, and your focus may be on a particular violin, and why is this violin sounding the way it does? Why is it maybe not working correctly, but your focus is very much on that one violin. Whereas in genomics, you look at not only perhaps that violin, but the relationship between that and the rest of the symphony. So you're trying to look at overall patterns in the way the music is being played, rather than focusing in on one particular aspect, if that makes sense. So that's the approach that we take. And it's a very big data driven approach, and it involves a lot of DNA sequencing. And DNA sequencing is really where my main interest and expertise lies. And I love it. It's really fun. It's a lot of science, but there's also a bit of art in trying to get high quality data and so forth. So that's really what I'm up to really on a day-to-day basis. And I think blood cell development is a great model system because there's a lot known about blood cell development, and you can isolate cells fairly easily. We work with mice, but there are some differences between mice and humans, but there's also a lot of similarities. It's been, a really fantastic system to work in.
Awesome. No, that's incredible. And, thank you for all the work that you've done. Do you think you could tell us a little bit about your academic path and kind of your journey through that, along with your process of getting your PhD, to kind of clarify kind of your journey and what that entails?
Yeah, sure. Interestingly, one of my original career goals, if you will, or options was to go into physical therapy. And I think that one of the reasons I had thought about that is because I was actually injured a lot growing up, and I was already doing physical therapy by the time I was a teenager. And I thought, wow, this is really exciting. I'd like to do this. And then I also debated, medical school and so forth. So I went on to be a biology major in college, but still really wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. And I took a job after I did graduate from college, and I took a job working for a cardiologist who did clinical research trials. And at the same time, I took my GREs for graduate school. I took my MCATs for medical school. And I got the opportunity then to work with some patients. And it was really in the context of these clinical trials, but we did data collection, and I got to interact with them. And I think at the time I was young and I felt a little bit uneasy sort of working with patients and kind of lacked the confidence of whether or not I could actually do that. And I also kind of, honestly, I felt a little uncomfortable like working with people who were ill. And I think now that I'm older, I think that was just a function of me being young, but that's the way I felt at the time. And then I decided that I kind of wanted to go into this. I like the science of medicine, but I wasn't quite sure I actually wanted to see patients. So that led me to graduate school, really. And I really did not have any research experience going into graduate school. And I think that I was a little behind my peers the first 6 months or so. But after that, I think I caught up fairly quickly. And I was actually one of the first ones in my class to finish. So I guess you could say that I did catch up pretty well.
Impressive. Now, your situation's a little different, that you finished your PhD at Penn State, but then you also went to stay and teach and work a little there, right? Now, that's not exactly a normal process, right? To stay at the same university?
That's correct. And it's actually highly frowned upon. Typically, at least in the life sciences, that's not really true in every field, but in life sciences in particular, it is frowned upon. And it's thought that the longer you stay at the university where you got your PhD, the less that you are going to grow as a scientist, but also the less you have to offer. They are looking for new people to come in and bring new knowledge and bring new technology. And if you've already learned sort of what the department is teaching, they don't feel that, you can bring in a lot of new expertise. So that's disappointing, but I understand that. And I will, if people happen to come to me for advice. There are a number of graduate students that have come to me privately, were wondering if should they stay, should they not stay. And although I stayed, and I can go into that, but I always advise people that it really is in their best interest to go somewhere else, because you're really limiting yourself, I think, in your overall options. Now, I did stay for family reasons. I met my husband just shortly before I graduated with my PhD. And he has an excellent job here at Penn State, and it's really one of the best places for him to work. So I decided to stay and do a postdoc here at Penn State. But I did switch fields. I went from Drosophila fruit flies to mice and studying GABA receptors. And they were responsible for the majority of inhibitory neurotransmission in the central nervous system. So I did feel like, I'm switching model systems, I'm switching fields. And, I wrote and got a postdoctoral research fellowship grant. So I did my best to develop myself as a scientist the best way that I could while still remaining at the university. But after a while, I kind of was like, all right, I think I need a break from that. And I went to a local company that did mitochondrial DNA forensics. And that was kind of interesting. But honestly, it was a really small company, and I kind of missed the university environment. I really like being in academia. I like being on campus. I like the interaction. And then I wound up eventually going back after my son was born. In between there, I did do some interesting other things. I did do some freelance writing for a couple of companies, and that was different. That was something I could do at home while I was, taking a little time off with my son, and I also taught a night class. So these were some things that allowed me to remain in science and be contributing to science in some way, but yet, taking a little bit of time, to devote to some family. And in my opinion, not going ahead and pursuing that tenure track, although, in some respects, I feel like, wow, am I wasting my PhD by not doing that? But really, there's really not enough tenure track positions for every PhD. And overall, I found that having, a scientist position, I have a faculty position, but it's non-tenured, actually grants me so much more flexibility and more freedom to, pursue some other things. So actually, for me, it worked out well. But again, if it's really someone's goal, to get a tenure track job, then staying at the same university is really not advised. At least, like I said, at least in life sciences.
So if you wouldn't mind, for our audience, could you define tenure track and maybe tell us a little bit about what the difference is?
Sure. So in many universities, if you would be hired tenure track, so what that would mean is that after a period of time, it's often about 6 years, you will then put in a very large application, if you will, to document almost everything that you've possibly done over your time, over your 6-year probationary period, if you will. And, you submit that to a committee of your peers who are going to look over everything you've done and decide if they're going to grant you tenure. And by tenure, a simple definition would be essentially like a job for life. I mean, once you get tenured, the way the system works, at least here in the US for now, is that, it's really, really difficult to get fired after you get tenure, so you pretty much, have a job and you have, but you're expected to bring in money, you're expected to support graduate students and train, and there's a lot of other responsibilities, that come with that. But it really is sort of a higher tier, professional job at the university. But again, it's really, you really have to be, especially nowadays, funding is very tight, and universities do expect you to be bringing in money. And that is often the big driver of whether money and published papers. So you also have to be publishing papers. But those two factors are really what, usually makes it or breaks it for an individual. We all like to think that teaching matters, and it does. But when it comes down to tenure decisions, it's really about, whether you've published enough papers and whether you're bringing in money. So it is a higher respected position. It's a much higher paid position. You are more autonomous, and at least in life sciences, most people run their own research lab. So you're sort of running your own little mini, I don't want to say company, but your own research group, and pretty much that you have fairly full control over it and the direction you want to go. So you're really directing your own research program, training graduate students and postdocs and undergraduate students. And that's where the real difference for me. I'm a research scientist, but I work for a tenured faculty member. So I am considered, like I said, I am faculty, but I'm not, I'm a fixed term. In other words, so my position is highly dependent on whether or not our lab has funding, whether or not my boss can pull in enough money for grants to support my salary. And it's actually interesting. Part of the reason, if I could digress a little bit, but it's because it's related. One of the reasons that I actually went on to earn my certification as a personal trainer is because around the same time that I was really doing a lot of strength work and movement and recovering from chronic pain, we were also really running out of money in the lab. Really down to, running on fumes. And I thought, oh my gosh, I need like an alternative career. I need some backup plan here. And, I thought, oh, I really like this strength training and maybe I'm going to do this, So actually that was one of the reasons why I went to pursue that. And I thought, wow, at the very least I could maybe then, try to move toward kinesiology or teach in that department by adding, the personal trainer certification or even just doing that, so it in a way, one of the reasons was more just also out of concern that I was might be out of a job. And I could go and try to work for someone else here at Penn State, but switching fields is not easy either, because you're learning a whole new set of, you're reading a whole other set of literature and relearning different field of science. And so I thought, well, that's certainly one option. So again, really someone in my position who's not tenured, you're also not guaranteed a job. And that can be an issue for people, especially if you're supporting a family. It's all soft money. It's all dependent on grants. So it's definitely a less stable position than, a tenured position.
So Cheryl, kind of with that being said, with you doing a lot of, different work in terms of research and with what you're doing, do you think you could kind of tell us kind of about a day in the life of kind of what you go through and what that normally entails? Sure.
So in the morning, I try to actually, before I even get to work, I try to, get my strength training and so forth for the morning. So I'm getting my child off to school. By the time I get to work, I try to be pretty focused because, things do get kind of busy. And I am a wet lab scientist. So most of my time is either at the bench, so actually setting up experiments, preparing DNA samples or RNA samples for DNA sequencing, or it involves some more mundane things that we all have to deal with, like answering emails. Because I do manage several projects that we have in the lab. There is a lot of communication back and forth to different collaborators, as well as handling some of the minutia and tedious stuff also that comes along with running a research project and submitting some progress reports to sponsors and so forth. So some of the things, different things we work on, we are working on some, we work with one investigator down in Virginia, for example, that studies LGL leukemia, which is large granulocytic lymphocytic leukemia. And, so that actually we get patient samples up from them and we prepare RNA, we isolate RNA from them and we sequence them. And then we send that data back down to the group at Virginia, for analysis. So a lot of what we do, and that's just one of the projects, we're working on. Another project we're working on with a large group of investigators is a project called Vision. And what that project involves is essentially trying to integrate the large amounts of genetic and genomic and epigenetic data that's available with regard to blood cell development and try and figure out how all that information pulls together. So right now in the field of genomics and epigenetics, the problem is not so much generating data, but how to interpret that. And so we're in charge of a very large project like that. So there's a lot of sort of coordination back and forth between investigators and who's doing what, because it really spans. There's 10 different investigators in the project. So it's a lot of my time, again, is either at the bench or sort of managing, interacting, and then one thing is, between setting up some experiments, I'll have 5 minutes there or 10 minutes there. And, it's a good time to, get into a few arguments on Twitter here and there, So,
there's some... would have a lot in common.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Fortunately, I think I've been on mostly on the same sides as him, so that's good. But So there is some time for play and for fun, really, and it is really a really good work environment. And despite the fact that my job is not fixed term, so it's not a permanent job like tenure, but again, it is flexible, it is fun, and we do have a good time in the lab, and I have a really great boss and a really good work environment. I really love being on campus. But so again, I do have sort of a variety of things really throughout the day, most days.
Yeah, Cheryl, that's awesome. I think it gives a lot of good insight to people who just aren't sure which direction to go. If they try to, head toward a PhD or an EDD or something like that, it doesn't have to be tied down specifically to academia.
Absolutely.
But, in allied health sciences, the labs are very different than in the educational teaching setting. If we're in the classroom, it's one thing. If we're in the labs, it's completely different. I mean, we're doing a lot of hands-on, a lot of palpating, a lot of special tests. Can you tell me a little bit about the differences between maybe educating somebody in a classroom versus educating somebody in a lab setting like you have set up?
Sure. Yeah, so and I have taught a few classes, and there you do try to engage the students, of course, and to bring them around, to let them kind of come to the conclusions or the goals of the lesson, if you will. But when you have a student who is interested in doing research, be it an undergraduate or a graduate student, that's where it's really time to kind of give them a problem and let them work through it, and let them try to figure it out. And I think that there's certain things that I like to impart on students in terms of technique, lab technique, and the importance of being sterile and with regard to handled cells or so forth. But when it comes to actually problem solving, that's where that's a big thing that you can get out of research. How to ask the right questions and how to find the answers. And that's really like a highly valuable skill that, essentially good critical thinking, right? Which I don't think that the traditional classroom is really set up for. So I do enjoy helping train, students that are involved in some sort of independent research project.
Awesome. That's a great point. Cheryl, what direction do you see yourself heading in regards to education and in the world of academia?
Yeah, that's a good question. For now, we are well funded, I think, for the next 5 years or so. And at that point, my boss will be about 71, 72-ish. So I think that at that point, I'm going to need to make a decision. What am I going to do after that? So it's not my research program, and I will need to decide. And that, I have to say, is I don't know the answer. I think that I have several options available to me. And part of that is some of the options that I've made for myself. And I purposely have tried to open doors so that I have several options. I won't be ready to retire in 5 years by any means. So my choices really, as I see them now, are I could continue, I could find another lab to sort of, if I wanted to stay in research and do that. I could also perhaps get a job, as a full-time instructor, either teaching for a biology or biochemistry department, something like that I'm in now, or try to get over toward like kinesiology, where I'm working with more, it's less molecular, but then I could bring in, some sort of combining my molecular knowledge and so forth. And I have taught a physiology course, but yet also draw on my experiences, through my own rehabilitation, through my own, strength and movement and experience doing personal training and so forth. So I have those options too. And, I really am I'm kind of undecided, but I've also been trying to, again, sort of get involved into multiple different things and make connections, via social media and so forth, to really try to grow as a person. And, but right now I'm really not entirely sure where I'm going to be.
Well, I think it's just good to know that there are so many options out there. Like I said, it's a very comforting feeling for somebody to know that it could take it, any number of avenues, and it all will work out in the end.
Yeah, actually, and that's a good point, because I feel that, I've accumulated enough credentials and enough knowledge where I do have multiple options available.
Yeah, that's awesome. Cheryl, speaking to the physical therapy side of your story, I've heard your story a couple times now on some of the podcasts, and I found it fascinating, which is why I'm so glad that you're on with us tonight, because you dealt with chronic pain for quite some time, right? And, can you tell us a little bit about that story? And we can go into it as much or as little as you'd like. But it was really a physical therapist that kind of helped you along your journey, right, to getting healthier and kind of a manageable status.
Yeah, well, and it's a very long story, so we'll just go with the sort of shortened version, I guess, if you will. But it was interesting. It was around the same time that I did return to Penn State that I stopped wearing these orthotics and motion control shoes when I was running. And I wound up getting, one injury sort of after another, and things kind of got out of hand. And it was stressful, admittedly, because I also was starting a new job at the time. So I certainly don't discount that, stress amplified, some of the things I was going through for sure. And also that, I'm also trying to learn a new field. I'm trying to learn into genomics. And at the same time, kind of feeling guilty because I'm preoccupied with trying to deal with this pain, and trying to get through the rest of my life. I was having even a lot of pain, just even in the lab, so a lot of pipetting, just working at the lab bench using these pipetters is a lot of repetitive motion. My thumb, I'm always up and down with my thumb. I yank my whole right arm into fairly severe external rotation every time I'm pipetting, looking up at the pipetter. It's probably kind of awkward looking, but it felt very comfortable, right? Because your body sort of adapts to that over time. And I've been pipetting for 20 years. But anyway, so it things kind of, snowballed. And I kind of felt that I really wasn't getting the appropriate care from the local medical community. I felt that they were not really listening to me and not listening to my story and not paying attention to some things I brought up in my history. It was a real problem and very challenging. And when I kind of was at rock bottom, which was about 2013, so 4 years or so into pain, I had finally met a physical therapist who slowly started, giving me a ladder rather than, a shovel, right? And help, because I kind of felt like that was part of the problem kind of early on is by sort of not getting kind of appropriate care. I felt that, I felt that my hole was getting deeper and people were just helping me dig it even further. But fortunately, like I said, I got the ladder and it was not easy to climb my way out. But yeah, it was a physical therapist who had the compassion to say, yeah, I'll help you and we'll work through this. And that was great. And thankfully, he helped me and we really worked on calming the nervous system and then slowly trying to regain relearning. I felt like relearning how to use my body really. And, starting with all the basic movement and strength and so forth. And, so I think one thing that was advantageous for me, for my recovery, since we're talking about academia and training, is the strong background that I had in essentially muscle in my postdoc for neuroscience. It was not difficult for me to understand and, where he was coming from when we would talk about, pain science. And certainly I've taught anatomy and physiology. So I felt like I had a good basis. And I think that I actually did wind up reading a lot of primary literature, like physical therapy literature, rehabilitation literature, some things not dissimilar than what you guys were, probably reading as DPT students. And I felt that also then by really immersing myself and trying to get familiar with some of that literature and really trying to pick up on some of the appropriate jargon and terminology. And that allowed me to express my concerns in a much clearer manner.
Yeah, that's
right?
a lot.
I feel like I'm not really getting the external rotation in this arm or whatever, as an example, rather than just saying, well, I can't do this, moving my arm around. So I felt that was actually really helpful for me to communicate, what I was feeling, because I had the background and I had the knowledge and I had the words to be able to communicate what I needed at that point.
Yeah, I was going to say that's a luxury we don't often have with a lot of our patients, It's trying to come, up to or down to their level, wherever it may be, to try to help communicate. But a follow-up to that question, this leads in pretty nicely, actually, is were there any doctors, physical therapists, or other healthcare providers that utilized any sort of educational methods that helped you grasp some healthcare-related knowledge? Or to the contrary, were there any techniques that were not very helpful in describing what was going on for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that I don't know that anyone, the physical therapist who wound up, who gave me the ladder to get out of the hole, right? He did actually share a lot of articles with me. Again, some of it was articles that were written in more common language, but also links to articles, in the primary literature. And so, those, as I was really just explaining, that what I thought for me was really helpful. And, with my educational background, I could grasp that, with maybe just a few follow-up questions and so forth. I think that earlier, though, I don't really recall anyone actually explaining that much. And they typically used, some fairly simple language which a lot of times I press for more, because it's not necessarily satisfactory to me, to have a simple explanation, especially when I felt that my problem was fairly complex.
Right.
And I thought that was, for me, it annoyed me more than anything, I remember this one orthopedist who was just basically like, oh, well, we're just, I recommend this lumbar steroidal injection. And I'm like, well, but I could see if the one nerve is kind of irritated, but how is this relating to the fact when I turn my head, I get vertigo? I just kind of felt that this is not helpful, your explanations here. I just really didn't feel that it was really encompassing all the problems that I was having. And I don't think that anyone really had bothered to talk. Really, I don't think early on that people were really using pain science education in an appropriate manner. And I did get a lot of that. We did talk a lot of that, like I said, from the physical therapist who helped me. But I had actually been through several rounds of physical therapy before that, as well as several orthopedists and chiropractors and so forth. And the version of pain science that I got was, well, there's nothing really wrong with you. And, I can appreciate, at the time, I appreciated the idea that, damage doesn't equal pain and pain doesn't necessarily equal damage and so forth. I didn't have a problem with that, but I did have a problem with there's nothing wrong with you. Because,
right.
Well, clearly something is wrong. I'm not saying it was structural damage, but something is not working the way it's supposed to be working. Right. And so, but it's people to be saying, well, there's nothing wrong with you. I could not, just so hard to wrap my head around that someone really would think that was a useful.
Especially when, you're really the expert on your own body. You know when something's right and when it's not. So it's definitely tough to hear that kind of stuff.
Right. Exactly. That's exactly right.
No, for sure. And I think you bring up a lot of good points on how to address that issue, from a patient perspective. But, and it's hard too, because, from the clinician side of it, sometimes, when you have someone who has someone, not exactly what you're going through, but who has a similar situation, where you definitely tell that there's more of a pain science component to it, and I'm curious what Scott's thought on this as well. But I think the hard part is kind of meeting the patient where they're at, because personally, I've had some experiences where I've noticed the patient and that's the biggest thing that I think is contributing to their problem. And I explain it in the way. Mm-hmm. And I feel like if the patient's not ready for it, they're going to take it the wrong way, even though you're not trying to say it that way. And
sure.
Sometimes that kind of limits your growth. And I don't know, I'm just curious because that's a struggle that I've had, when to pull that card, when to, to work on some of the other stuff until they're ready to hear that and then hit it. That's a struggle that I've faced from a clinician side. I'm wondering, Scott, what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think, for me, I've been doing this for about 10 years now. It really becomes a practice of learning to read people. And I mean, you just get better at it as you go. But you can kind of tell, there's a lot of visual cues they'll give you. There's a lot of verbal cues they'll give you. There's a lot of underlying connotations that you can kind of start to feel those out and determine, when might be the right time to pull that trigger. But we had talked about a little bit earlier too, it's a matter of, coming up and down to the patient's needs, right? So if Cheryl came in to see me and she tells me, oh, she's a PhD, well, right away, I want to kind of start talking and engaging how much, about the research she might know. And maybe then it's, acceptable to give her some more aggressive articles that are a little bit deeper, maybe start with some of the easy ones, which it sounds like your physical therapist did, and then give you a little bit more graduated articles that are a little bit more difficult to get through, but still show you what's going on and what the studies are showing. So yeah, I think it's really just a matter of, coming to your patient's needs and meeting them on the level that they need to be met on in order to kind of become a successful team and work through it together.
No, absolutely, Scott. You're totally right. That's a good point.
Yeah, and I think that it's also probably, from my perspective, as a patient, important to recognize that, the various components, right, of the biopsychosocial, that the relative proportions contributing to a patient's problems, vary depending on the circumstances, right? And I think that for me, there was people, the first question is, are you depressed? And honestly, I really did not feel that I was depressed. I was angry. I mean, I was angry that I could not really find anyone to kind of help me, or why is my foot, constantly tingling? Why am I feel like I'm dragging my right leg behind me? And I don't discount that, the anger was also a contributing factor, right? That is a psychological component. But I felt that so many people actually wanted to push the depression aspect of it more than I actually felt that was needed.
Right. And it kind of felt like, you weren't being listened to, kind of like what you said before.
Right, exactly. Like, well, I just want the tingling to get out of my foot. I recognize that, that can't just be completely psychological. It's tingling, So there was that balance of, I recognize there's no damage, that doesn't mean there's damage, but I still don't want the tingling in my foot, and I actually kind of at one point, I even agreed to try an antidepressant because I felt like, all right, I'll try it. I'm not depressed, but I'll try it. And I was like, all right, fine. So I tried it for like 2 months.
Yeah,
I felt it made no difference whatsoever.
Away, right?
No, it didn't make it go away. And I said, like, I go back and I said, well, it didn't make the tingling go away. And he's like, well, I didn't think it was going to make it go away. I just thought you would care less about it. I'm like, what? That's not helpful.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow.
So that was not helpful. That just made me more angry. Right. So for me, anger was more the problem as I kind of just wanted to get back to doing what I wanted to be able to do. And I wasn't really depressed. And I tried to do as much as possible. I'm walking 4 miles a day. I'm doing my job. I'm not sitting around being depressed. But I was mad that I felt stalled, for progress.
Right. No, for sure. Cheryl, we like to end each episode by posing this question to our guest. If you could change one aspect of higher education, whether that be related to healthcare or research, what aspect would you change and how?
That's another good question. I don't really know too much, to be honest, of what's actually involved, in the DPT program. But one thing that I think is important, regardless of your profession, is to make sure that you can think critically. And I think that the reason that that's important too is to be able to understand the literature. If you're reading a paper and you value evidence-based medicine and evidence-based research and what those findings are, I think that you really do need to have a good feel for the limitations of what that paper and what that research is saying. So I think that actually having some sort of research experience, be it doing some undergraduate research experience or assisting in some project, some sort of clinical trial, something along those lines where you actually spend a little time, maybe not having to do an entire research project on yourself, but immerse yourself a little bit in some aspect of research so that you can see how those questions are developed, to see what the limitations are when it's in terms of data analysis and interpretation. Because I think that that's, pretty key to be able to really get good takeaways from what's coming out in the literature, because I'm sure you guys have seen too some papers and the conclusion that's in the media, is a little far-fetched from what actually the paper says. And, sometimes, even if you go ahead and read the paper, if you didn't realize that, well, geez, the sample size was only 15, maybe I should really I should really give this a second thought or take this with a grain of salt. So I think that kind of understanding research design and so forth is important. And I think, like I said, some sort of research experience can help you in terms of being better to understand what that evidence is.
No, absolutely. I think that's a great idea, because, as a clinician, because we want evidence-based practice. And of course, that's kind of a blend between, research, clinical experience, and patient values. And, I think really understanding, the true accuracy and the true limitations of that research definitely is important because, some people like to cite these big studies and you're like, well, when you actually look at it, you're like, how can we really accurately infer that to all the people?
Right. Right. And that's a thing too, is with especially a lot of clinical trials, and the inclusion-exclusion criteria doesn't necessarily allow that conclusion to translate to a larger population, right? Because some of it can be quite limited in that respect.
Right. No, absolutely. Well, Cheryl, thank you so much for coming on our podcast today to chat with us today. And do you think you can let our audience know where they can find you online and on social media?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me as a guest. I'm on Twitter a lot. I'm on Keller Capone Ph.D., and I do go for about 50% science and 50% sort of strength training, physical therapy, pain. I like to argue on both sides. So, either way, it's good. But no, I do try to share information as well, not just get into Twitter arguments. But and then I am on Instagram at Cheryl Keller Capone, and I do have a blog, again, Cheryl Keller Capone, Science and Strength, and that's on WordPress. I have not posted in a while. I have a lot of things kind of piling up at work, but I do need to get back in there and write a post sometime soon.
Awesome. And a shameless plug for my Summer of Move #Team Quattro teammate.
Yes, exciting.
Yes, it starts tomorrow, so everybody get out there and move and get active.
And I'm starting tomorrow with my very first triathlon, and I'm so excited. I kind of feel that, it's sort of a culmination of, hey, I beat persistent pain, and I'm doing this for myself, but I'm also doing it to show the world, hey, I did it.
Yeah, thanks so much.
That's awesome.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you again very much.
Thank you for attending class today, and we hope that you learned something and gained value from the content.
If you'd like to schedule office hours with us, feel free to add us on Twitter at HET Podcast, on Instagram, HET Podcast, on Facebook, the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast, and the homepage, healthcareeducationtransformationpodcast.com.
And for those of you following along in the syllabus, extra credit can be obtained by liking us, sharing us, and leaving a review.
Let's continue our journey up Mount Educational Success as lifelong learners.